Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. The largest terrorist attack on the United States since 9/11. That is Benjamin Applebaum, the New York Times, putting a tweet out this afternoon consistent with the information we have now published in the New York Times under David Sanger and Nicole Pearl-Ross bylines, that North Korea launched a cyber attack on Sony Pictures in order to force the non-viewing of a new movie about North Korea, a Sony movie. It's a Hollywood movie, but in any event, the decision has been made at Sony to pull the movie. It will not open on Christmas Day. This is cyber terrorism. The New York Times story also mentions China. It also mentions something called Dark Seoul, a gang that has been implicated in the past, attacks on South Korean banks, also on oil facilities in the Middle East, Aramco. This gang may or may not be working for the North Koreans, for the Chinese. It may be the North Koreans. It may be the Chinese. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com joins me. First, Gordon, a very good evening to you. A cyber attack associated with Hollywood is not how we expected, but I'll turn it around. This is an attack on the economy of the United States. It's a successful attack, and as we know, when terror works, they do it again and again and again. What do we know about the North Koreans and China working together for cyber terror?
There is a unit of North Korean hackers in the city of Shenyang, which is about 3 hours from the North Korean border, that is essentially permanently there. And they are used for attacks on foreign networks. They probably were used against Sony because we know that the attacks on Sony were routed through Chinese Internet Protocol addresses. So China, because it has the Great Firewall, it knows everything that people do. And so clearly China had knowledge of the attacks, and it probably was also complicit in them.
There's news today about Cuba, especially because the Obama administration, the president himself making announcements on the road towards normalization between Havana and Washington. Alan Gross, an innocent man who was abused by the Cuban dictatorship these last years, has returned to the United States in exchange for Cuban spies, men who were convicted in acts, some of which included the murder of 4 American citizens several years ago. They've been returned. All that news is ahead of us. In addition, we have the news on Ukraine, the news on the Russian ruble, all of these links. However, we start with terror because this is a piece of a story that will grow in the 21st century. You don't send bombers when you can hack. Stephen Yates, who is chairman of the Idaho Republican Party, most importantly, he's CEO of DC International Advisory, and before that, in his earlier life, he was a member of the Bush administration. He worked in the vice president's office. Joins us now. Stephen, the attack by the North Koreans, and the New York Times is the one pointing to official attack. That has not been said by the Obama administration yet. But in any event, this puts into play the question about what is to be done. You were present at the beginning of how do you respond to terror. Imagine for us the conversations going on in Washington right now, especially in the Obama administration. How much time do they have to decide whether they're going to retaliate or whether they're going to wait and hope this blows over? Good evening to you, Stephen.
Good evening, John. Well, that's exactly the scenario, isn't it? Basically, they don't have very much time to decide if they're going to respond in a meaningful way in the short term. But the way our government has tended to deal with cyber attacks and this kind of a threat really has been to put it off for quite a long time. So they have tended to think only about cyber defenses, but here we have another example of if someone can reach out and touch you and do these things to you, shouldn't you also have the ability to do things the other way to make a meaningful difference to their calculus? And they have made a significant impact on economic decisions in our country with regard to Sony. I'm not entirely sure I understand the rationale for not airing the movie. And I don't think that will in any way stop the movie really from circulating. In some ways, it might actually provoke an underground distribution that's quite large.
You know, Steve, it's very important because we focus on economics and we talk about Angela Jolie because, of course, there was a conversation among Sony executives about what a brat she was. But there's really a very important issue here, and that is if these attacks by North Korea go unpunished, then we are essentially saying to the world that people in Pyongyang, Beijing, Tehran, Moscow get to determine what the American people see, what they read, because clearly this is just the opening gambit. And if North Korea gets away with this, we can see that these countries are going to be able to affect discourse in the United States. Essentially, they're attacking the core of the American democracy.
Well, they are, and others have tried to do this over the years. I mean, of course, the Chinese government had tried to censor Hollywood in terms of its depictions of the Dalai Lama and the Tibet issue, and many other powers have tried to do things. Of course, there's been a lot of censorship and self-censorship with regard to discussions that touch upon Islam in the Middle East, and so you're quite right that this is a potential trend setter. If the North Koreans can do this and succeed, it's an open invitation for a new kind of warfare, and it's economic warfare. It's something that we have talked about repeatedly, that is an area that the Chinese have looked very carefully at, rather than the classical form of warfare, which they have increased capabilities to.
Gordon, be cynical. What's in this for China to stand back and allow this to happen and not intervene, not stop it, shrug its shoulders as the United States thrashes around for a response? How does China gain?
There's a couple things here. First of all, every time that North Korea acts up, we go to Beijing and we say, please, please, please deal with those nasty North Koreans. And the Chinese, being ruthlessly pragmatic, exact concessions from the United States on other issues. So that's going to be one thing. And second of all, with the heat on the North Koreans, the Chinese then get to continue to attack our companies for commercial purposes. And to put this into context, the Blair-Huntsman Commission said that each and every year, U.S. companies lose intellectual property in the value of somewhere around $475 billion. That's the amount of total U.S. exports to Asia. That's an enormous number. Even if it's only $100 billion, which some people say, it's still a mortal wound.
Stephen, during the Bush administration, we debated what it means to respond to non-state actors launching terrorist attacks, threatening terrorist attacks, causing the United States to rearrange its defenses. And those days, we puzzled about, does terror have an address? In this instance, you can all see where I'm going. Terror has an address, Stephen. It's Pyongyang and it's Beijing. Does not that mean that the United States government is in a position to respond? We knew Tokyo, we knew Berlin, and we acted.
Yeah, well, John, you're right. Of course, we do know the address, and of course, we're within the realm of needing to respond. And one of the elements of doctrine that came out in the post 9/11 era was we are looking, of course, at who the perpetrators are, and people can debate all they want about whether the governments are active or just hosts. But if you host these kinds of activities, by definition, you now need to be responsible. And that's, I think, the correlation with the approach that was taken to terrorism and thinking about this new kind of terrorism in the cyber realm. It's not enough to just say, well, I didn't order it as a government. If it's going on through your territory, it is now responsible. You're now responsible for taking care of it. You're with us or against us.
This is especially true with regard to China and cyber, because China maintains the most sophisticated set of internet controls in the world today, and it knows what everybody is doing. If you touch a key on your keyboard and you're in China, people in Beijing can know about it. So obviously, because Chinese IP addresses were used, Beijing knew what was going on, and this is the critical thing, and it's something that the United States can't avoid because the amount of dollars are too much, and as I talked about, the principles of the core of American democracy are at stake. We've got to do something.
Just quickly, gentlemen. Stephen, your instincts on this. Did China, Beijing, Pyongyang, North Korea, did they make a mistake thinking that this was just about Hollywood and not realizing that this is a threat to the liberty of the United States?
I think that they have, but that remains to be seen. We have not yet responded, and until we do, maybe they're right.
The Obama administration, right now, Gordon, they haven't acted. That tells me, you know that old saying out west in cowboy movies, you better use that gun about 2 seconds after it clears your holster? The 2 seconds are up, Gordon.
Absolutely, because once you make the public accusation, you've got to do something about it.
Gordon Chang and Stephen Yates. I'm John Batchelor.